Between 1789 and 1898, nearly all of Latin America broke free from European powers, while the United States expanded from a coastal nation to a continental power spanning from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The fight for freedom and control was bloody and relentless, but through war and perseverance, the map of the Americas transformed completely. Here's what life was really like during the rise of the American nations. Before we start, if these help you sleep, a like or subscribe would be cool. Also, drop where you're listening from and the time. I check the comments and it's crazy seeing people from like Australia and Norway on the same video. Okay, tonight it's the rise of the Americas. But hold up. Get comfortable first. I mean it. Fix your pillows, grab that blanket. This one's worth settling in for. Your eyes open to darkness. The air is thick with wood smoke and the sour smell of unwashed bodies. It's 1789, and you're not waking up to the gentle ping of a smartphone alarm, but to church bells in a Spanish colonial town somewhere in the Americas. The rough wool blanket scratches against your skin as you sit up on your straw mattress. If you're lucky, you're a Creole, born in the Americas but of pure Spanish descent. If you're not, you might be a mestizo, a mix of Spanish and native blood, or worse, a slave or an indigenous person with virtually no rights at all. And the thing is, this rigid social hierarchy is about to crack wide open. So here's the deal. At the dawn of the 1800s, the map of the Americas looked nothing like it does today. I know, shocking, right? North America had this brand new experiment called the United States hugging the Atlantic coast. The Spanish controlled most of the continent from California to Argentina, and the Portuguese had this massive chunk called Brazil. Oh, and the British were still hanging around in Canada, eyeing their former colonies like an ex who can't move on. But beneath the surface, holy shit was there tension. You know when you can just feel something's about to snap? That was the Americas in 1789. The American Revolution had just shown that, hey, maybe Europeans don't have to rule everything over here. And then, plot twist. The French Revolution kicks off, and suddenly revolutionary ideas are spreading like wildfire. Picture this, Mexico City, 1789. It's the largest city in the Americas with about 130,000 people. The streets are a chaotic mix of splendor and squalor. Grand cathedrals and government buildings tower over narrow, winding streets where sewage literally runs down the middle. No joke. People used to shout, "Agua va," water coming, before tossing waste out the window. And you thought your apartment building was bad. The stench is unbearable, a European visitor wrote in his diary. How people of quality manage to live here is beyond comprehension. But here's the weird part. Despite the smell and the chaos, the Spanish colonial cities were actually better planned than most European ones. They had these perfect grid layouts with a central plaza, a cathedral, and government buildings. It's just that, infrastructure wasn't exactly priority number one for the colonial powers. They were too busy shipping gold and silver back to Europe. Speaking of which, let me paint you a picture of how the whole system worked. So, let me get this straight, says a newly arrived Spanish official to his colleague. We take their gold and silver, ship it back to Spain, and in return, we sell them manufactured goods at inflated prices. His colleague nods, sipping his wine, and we only let them trade with Spain. It's been working for 3 centuries. Genius, the new guy laughs. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. Everything could go wrong. See, by the late 1700s, this system was seriously pissing off the Creole elite, those Spanish-blooded but American-born folks who'd accumulated wealth and education but couldn't get the top government jobs. Those plum positions were reserved for peninsulares, people born in Spain who came over. I spent way too long researching the social hierarchies of Spanish America for this. Like, concerningly long, but it matters because this whole rigid caste system was the powder keg that eventually blew the whole empire apart. At the top, you had the peninsulares, Spanish-born officials and merchants who made up maybe 1% of the population but held all the political power. Then came the Creoles, American-born, but of pure Spanish blood. These folks owned the haciendas, huge agricultural estates, and mines. They had money, but were basically second-class citizens politically. Below them were the mestizos, mixed Spanish and indigenous. They worked as artisans, shopkeepers, and lower-level bureaucrats. Then mulattoes, mixed Spanish and African, often working as skilled labourers. Finally, at the bottom, indigenous peoples and African slaves who did all the brutal labour that made the whole system run. My father owns half the silver mines in Potosi, a young Creole complains to his friends at a Mexico City tavern in 1795. I studied law in Madrid, yet some glorified clerk fresh off the boat from Seville gets appointed to the audiencia while I'm passed over again. His mestizo servant, pretending not to listen as he pours more wine, files this information away. The cracks are showing. Meanwhile, up north, the United States was dealing with its own growing pains. The revolutionary fervour had settled into the mundane business of actually running a country, and it wasn't going great at first. Imagine waking up in Philadelphia in 1789. The city's about 42,000 people, which made it the biggest in the United States at the time. You're probably in a small wooden house, maybe 2 rooms if you're lucky. The smell of baking bread mixes with the less pleasant aromas of horse manure and open sewers. If you're wealthy, you might have a brick home with glass windows, but most people were making do with oiled paper to keep out the elements. The Constitution has been ratified, but will it hold? A newspaper editor asks as he sets type for the day's edition. There are already whispers of secession in some quarters. The infant United States was basically held together with hope and string. The Articles of Confederation had been a disaster, and the new Constitution was untested. People identified more with their states than with this new federal government. And the economy? Complete shambles after the war. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the financial genius with questionable people skills. So your plan is to assume all the state's debts and create a national bank? President Washington asks, looking skeptical. Yes, sir, Hamilton replies crisply. It will bind the states to the federal government and establish our credit with European powers. And this won't give too much power to the central government. Hamilton's silence speaks volumes. This debate between federal power and states' rights would define American politics for, the next century or so. No big deal. But here's something wild about daily life back then. The lack of what we'd consider basic necessities. Forget indoor plumbing or electricity. Most Americans in 1789 were farmers who produced almost everything they needed themselves. They grew their food, made their clothes, built their furniture. Cash was scarce, and most business was done through bartering. Morning started at dawn, not because people were early risers, but because candles and oil lamps were expensive. You worked with the sun. Women's work was particularly brutal, cooking over an open hearth, no easy bake ovens here, making soap from lye and animal fat, which could literally burn your skin off if you weren't careful, spinning thread, weaving cloth, sewing clothes by hand, preserving food, and of course raising a dozen kids because, high infant mortality meant you needed backup children. You know what's crazy? Teeth. People's teeth were absolute disasters. By age 40, most Americans had lost most of their teeth. George Washington was inaugurated wearing painful, ill-fitting dentures made from ivory, gold, and, I kid you not, other people's teeth. Not like those pristine white choppers you see in the portraits. The president's new teeth pain him considerably, his secretary writes. He can barely close his mouth and speaking is quite difficult. Washington nods grimly, unable to respond. Back in Latin America, things were about to get interesting thanks to a short, ambitious Frenchman, Napoleon Bonaparte. See, in 1808, Napoleon decided to invade Spain and Portugal. He forced the Spanish king to abdicate and put his own brother Joseph on the throne. This threw the Spanish Empire into total chaos. Suddenly, colonial officials didn't know who they were supposed to be taking orders from. The captured Spanish king or this French usurper. This was the opening the Creoles had been waiting for. "We remain loyal to King Ferdinand," announced the Cabildo town council of Caracas in 1810, dominated by Creoles. "But since he is imprisoned by the French, we must govern ourselves until his return." Wink wink, nudge nudge, similar juntas, governing councils, popped up across Spanish America, all supposedly loyal to the imprisoned Spanish king, but increasingly acting like independent governments. In Buenos Aires, a lawyer named Mariano Moreno is sitting at his desk, quill in hand, drafting declarations for the new junta. "We claim to be loyal to Ferdinand," his colleague observes, "but these policies you're drafting look suspiciously like independence." Moreno barely glances up. "How observant of you. Perhaps keep that observation to yourself, yes?" The revolution was beginning, but in this weird, roundabout way where nobody wanted to be the first to actually say the word independence. Meanwhile, in Haiti, which, fun fact, was the second independent nation in the Americas after the United States, a full-blown slave revolution had succeeded in 1804. This absolutely terrified slave owners throughout the Americas, especially in the southern United States, where almost 40% of the population was enslaved. Imagine waking up on a cotton plantation in Georgia in 1810. If you're white and own the plantation, you live in relative comfort in a large house with servants. If you're enslaved, you're crammed into a crude cabin with dirt floors, waking before dawn to begin another day of back-breaking labor. "Did you hear about Haiti?" one enslaved man whispers to another as they work the fields. "They overthrew their masters." "Quiet," the other hisses, the overseers watching. The fear of slave rebellions hung over the American South like a storm cloud. In 1800, an enslaved man named Gabriel had planned a major uprising in Virginia. The plot was discovered, and Gabriel and 25 others were hanged. But the message was clear. The institution of slavery was sitting on a powder keg. Back in Spanish America, a young Venezuelan aristocrat named Simón Bolívar was watching all these developments with intense interest. After studying in Europe and witnessing Napoleon's coronation in Italy, he returned home with his head full of revolutionary ideas. In a dimly lit room in Caracas, Bolívar leans over a map spread across a table, surrounded by fellow Creoles. "Gentlemen," he says, his voice low but intense, "the moment has come. Spain is weak. We will never have a better opportunity." One of the older men looks nervous. "But to openly declare independence, the Peninsulares will fight. Blood will be shed." Bolívar's dark eyes flash. "Blood is the price of liberty, my friend. Are we willing to pay it?" The silence that follows is his answer. Up in New England, daily life looked quite different from the plantations south. Small family farms dotted the landscape along with growing mill towns where the early seeds of American industry were taking root. The day begins before dawn in a farmhouse in Massachusetts. A family of 7 shares 2 beds in a single room. The father and oldest son head out to tend the fields while the mother and daughters begin the endless cycle of domestic work. The youngest children collect eggs and feed the chickens. "Will you be going to the new textile mill, Abigail?" the mother asks her oldest daughter as they knead bread dough. "Mr. Johnson is offering $2 a week," Abigail replies. "More than I could make sewing at home." The mother's face shows mixed emotions, pride at the extra income, worry for her daughter working among the noisy, dangerous machines. These textile mills were changing the face of New England. Young women called mill girls left farm life to work in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. The hours were long, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, but the wages offered independence unknown to previous generations of women. Out on the frontier, which at this point meant western Pennsylvania and Kentucky, life was even more rugged. Dawn breaks over a small clearing in the Kentucky wilderness. A log cabin sits at its center, smoke curling from the chimney. A man emerges, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line before heading to the crude barn to milk the cow. Inside, his wife stirs a pot of cornmeal mush over the fire. Their 4 children sleep on pallets around the single room. "Indians spotted near the Wilsons' place yesterday," the man says when he returns. His wife's hands freeze for just a moment. "Friendly?" "Shawnee, moving north." He sets down the milk. "Should be fine if we don't provoke them." The tension of frontier life was constant, not just from Native Americans, who were understandably not thrilled about settlers taking their land, but from the harsh conditions themselves. Medical care was basically non-existent. A broken leg could be a death sentence. Childbirth was terrifyingly dangerous. And winter was the season everyone dreaded. Imagine this. It's January 1800 and you're in a log cabin on the frontier. The temperature has dropped to well below freezing. Your cabin is essentially one room with a fireplace, and heat doesn't exactly distribute evenly. The side facing the fire might be relatively comfortable, but a few feet away, water freezes in the bucket overnight. You sleep fully clothed under every blanket and animal hide you own. If you're lucky and relatively wealthy, your cabin has wooden floors. If not, you're living with packed dirt that turns to mud whenever snow melts off boots. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Your nearest neighbor might be miles away. No phone, no internet, not even regular mail service. If something went wrong, illness, injury, attack, you were on your own. "Sometimes I don't see another soul besides my family for months at a stretch," a frontier woman wrote in her journal. "The silence of the forest can make you forget the sound of your own voice." But despite, or perhaps because of, these hardships, Americans were developing a distinct national character, self-reliant, practical, and increasingly different from their European ancestors. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected president, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in the new republic, something we totally take for granted now, but was a really big deal at the time. Meanwhile, in Latin America, the rumblings of revolution were growing louder. In Mexico, a parish priest named Miguel Hidalgo was secretly meeting with other Creoles, planning an uprising against Spanish rule. In a small room behind the church in the town of Dolores, Hidalgo speaks passionately to a group of conspirators. "It is not just independence we seek," he says, his eyes bright with conviction, "but justice for the indigenous and mestizo peoples, an end to slavery, land reform." A wealthy Creole shifts uncomfortably. "Father Hidalgo, we support independence, but these other ideas, they go too far." Hidalgo fixes him with a stern gaze. then perhaps your vision of freedom is too narrow, senor. This tension between conservative Creoles who wanted independence but with social structures intact and more radical leaders who envisioned deeper changes would shape the coming revolutions throughout Latin America. By 1810, the stage was set for dramatic change across the Americas. The Spanish Empire was reeling from Napoleon's invasion. The United States was expanding westward, doubling its territory with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And throughout the hemisphere, new ideas about liberty, equality, and nationhood were taking root. The morning light filters through the windows of a Creole mansion in Buenos Aires. A man stands before a mirror, adjusting his cravat. Today is May 25th, 1810, the day the Cabildo will meet to decide whether to form a junta to govern independently from the Spanish-appointed viceroy. "Are you certain this is wise?" his wife asks, watching him from the doorway. "The viceroy has the military." "The military is full of Creoles like me," he replies, meeting her gaze in the mirror, "and we have had enough of Spanish rule." As he steps out into the Buenos Aires morning, the air feels electric with possibility. In the central plaza, crowds are already gathering, demanding change. The old order is about to collapse, and a new chapter in the history of the Americas is about to begin. Not like your warm, comfortable bed right now with no revolutions to worry about, just the gentle sound of my voice telling you about a world that changed forever in the span of a single lifetime. The dawn of the 1800s saw a hemisphere on the edge of transformation. The seeds planted by the American and French revolutions were about to bear fruit across Latin America, while the young United States was taking its first uncertain steps as a nation. For ordinary people throughout the Americas, from enslaved Africans to indigenous peoples, from frontier settlers to city dwellers, daily life was about to change in ways they could barely imagine. And the men who would lead these changes, Bolivar, San Martin, Jefferson, Madison, were preparing to step onto history's stage, but that's getting ahead of our story. The real fireworks are about to begin. The morning of September 16th, 1810 started like any other in the small town of Dolores, Mexico. The church bell rang as usual, but this time it wasn't calling people to mass, it was calling them to revolution. Father Miguel Hidalgo stood before the growing crowd, his voice carrying across the town square. "My children," he shouted, "a new dispensation comes to us today. Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the lands stolen from your forefathers?" The crowd roared. "Will you defend your rights as true patriots?" "Viva Mexico!" someone cried, and the chant spread like wildfire. This was the Grito de Dolores, the cry of Dolores, that kicked off Mexico's 11-year struggle for independence. And it wasn't going to be pretty. See, what's wild about Latin American independence is that it wasn't just a fight against Spain. It was several civil wars happening at once. Creoles fought Peninsulares, conservatives fought liberals, indigenous people and enslaved Africans fought for their own freedom within the wider fight for national freedom. Basically, it was a hot mess. Hidalgo quickly gathered a massive army, mostly indigenous and mestizo peasants armed with machetes, slings, and a few stolen guns. They were angry, and they had every reason to be. Decades of exploitation, famine, and brutal treatment had left them with nothing to lose. "Why do you follow this priest?" a Spanish officer asks a captured indigenous fighter. The man's eyes harden. "Because he promises us land. Because he says we are men, not animals." When was the last time a Spaniard said that to me? The Spanish officer has no answer. Hidalgo's army swelled to nearly 80,000, absolutely massive for the time. They captured the city of Guanajuato and went on a rampage, killing hundreds of Spanish and Creole residents. It was bloody, chaotic, and scared the hell out of the upper classes, even those who sympathized with independence. "This isn't revolution," a wealthy Creole tells his wife as they flee the city. "This is revenge." And he wasn't wrong. 300 years of oppression doesn't lead to polite political change. It leads to violence. The Spanish eventually regrouped and defeated Hidalgo's untrained army. Hidalgo was captured, defrocked, and executed. His head was hung from the granary in Guanajuato as a warning to other would-be revolutionaries. Didn't work. Another priest, José María Morelos, took up the cause. More disciplined and politically savvy than Hidalgo, Morelos formalized the independence movement, calling for abolition of slavery and equality of all citizens. Again, this freaked out many conservative Creoles who wanted independence, but with them at the top of the social hierarchy. Meanwhile, down in South America, things were heating up too. Imagine standing on the bank of the Paraná River on May 18th, 1811. The sun beats down as you watch a small flotilla of boats carrying the makeshift patriot army of what will eventually become Argentina. They're heading to confront Spanish loyalist forces in Paraguay. The general, Manuel Belgrano, paces the deck of the lead vessel, deep in thought. One of his officers approaches. "General, the men are asking why we fight. Many have families in provinces still loyal to Spain." Belgrano gestures at the vast, wild landscape stretching around them. "Tell them we fight so that this land belongs to us, not to masters across an ocean. Tell them their children will be citizens, not subjects. The war for South American independence would be long and complicated, involving two of the most fascinating figures in American history, Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín." While all this revolutionary action was happening in Latin America, the United States was dealing with its own problems. The tension between Britain and France had pulled America into a bizarre situation where both European powers were interfering with US shipping. Britain was even impressing American sailors, basically kidnapping them and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. "They took my son right off the deck of our merchant ship," a weathered sailor tells his companions in a Boston tavern. "Said he was a British deserter. He's never even been to England." One of his friends slams his tankard down. "President Madison needs to do something. We didn't win our independence just to be pushed around like this." Madison did do something. In 1812, the US declared war on Britain, a ballsy move considering Britain was the world's superpower at the time. The War of 1812 was a weird conflict. The Americans tried to invade Canada and got their asses handed to them. The British burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. The US won a few notable naval battles, which was surprising since the British Navy was supposedly invincible. And the whole thing ended with the Treaty of Ghent, which basically said, let's pretend this never happened and go back to how things were before. The weird thing is, Americans treated it like a massive victory. This was partly because news travelled so slowly that the biggest American victory, the Battle of New Orleans, happened after the peace treaty was signed. No one there knew the war was already over. The morning after the Battle of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson walks the battlefield, surveying the carnage. Over 2,000 British soldiers lie dead or wounded compared to just 13 Americans. "My God," his aide whispers, "we've actually defeated the British regulars." Jackson's weathered face shows little emotion. "Remember this. They said American farmers and frontiersmen couldn't stand against European professionals. They were wrong." That victory turned Jackson into a national hero and eventually propelled him to the presidency. But more importantly, it gave Americans this swaggering sense of national pride that would fuel their westward expansion. Back in South America, Simón Bolívar was having a rough time. After early successes, his revolutionary forces had been defeated and he fled to Jamaica. But in 1816, he made a comeback that would change history. Picture this, a small flotilla of ships approaching the Venezuelan coast in 1816. On the lead vessel stands Bolívar, now 33 years old, scarred by defeat but more determined than ever. He's just secured support from the newly independent Haiti, the first nation to recognize Venezuela's bid for independence. "What if we fail again?" asks one of his officers as the shoreline comes into view. "Then we will try again," Bolívar replies, "and again, until we succeed or until I die." Bolívar wasn't just fighting for Venezuela, he dreamed of a united Spanish America, a single great nation stretching from Mexico to Argentina. It was an almost impossibly ambitious vision. Meanwhile, in the southern cone of South America, another revolutionary leader was making his move. José de San Martín, who had fought against Napoleon in Spain before returning to his native Argentina to join the independence struggle, was planning something that seemed utterly insane: crossing the Andes Mountains with an army to liberate Chile and then moving on to Peru, the center of Spanish power in South America. The Andes crossing was one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. We're talking about 5,000 men, thousands of horses and mules, artillery pieces, supplies, all going over mountain passes up to 15,000 feet high, where the air is so thin you can barely breathe, and temperatures drop below freezing at night. Imagine you're a soldier in San Martin's army of the Andes. Dawn breaks over the mountain camp, revealing a brutal landscape of rock and snow. Your lips are cracked from the cold, your lungs burn with each breath in the thin air, and you've already watched dozens of your comrades succumb to the conditions. "How much further?" you ask the mountain guide as you saddle your mule. "2 more days to the summit," he replies. "If the weather holds, then another week down the other side." And if the weather doesn't hold, the guide just gives you a grim look and walks away. Somehow, San Martin's army made it across. They surprised the Spanish forces in Chile, defeated them at the Battle of Chacabuco, and liberated Santiago. Chile was free, but San Martin knew the job wasn't done. As long as Peru remained in Spanish hands, the independence of Argentina and Chile would be threatened. So he built a navy, sailed up the coast, and in 1821 declared the independence of Peru. Around this same time, Bolívar was fighting his way across northern South America. He liberated Colombia in 1819 and Venezuela in 1821. Then, in one of history's most dramatic moments, Bolívar and San Martín met in Guayaquil, Ecuador in 1822. No one knows exactly what was said in that meeting, but we do know that after it, San Martín retired from public life and went into exile in Europe, leaving Bolívar to continue the fight. "Why did you step aside?" San Martin's aide asks as they board the ship that will take them away from South America. San Martin gazes back at the receding shoreline because South America is not big enough for both Bolívar and me. With San Martin gone, Bolívar completed the liberation of Peru and created a new country called Bolivia, named after himself, which is a power move if I've ever seen one. By 1825, Spanish control over the American mainland was effectively over. Let's pause and think about what this means. In the span of about 15 years, an area larger than Europe broke free from colonial rule. New nations were born: Mexico, Haiti, Gran Colombia, which later split into Colombia, Venezuela and Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. It was a geopolitical earthquake. But independence didn't solve the fundamental problems these new nations faced. Colonial rule had left them with weak institutions, deep social divisions, and economies dependent on exporting raw materials. The next century would be marked by instability, civil wars, and struggles to define what these new nations would become. While Latin America was fighting for independence, the United States was pushing westward at an incredible pace. Imagine waking up in a wagon somewhere in what would later become Indiana around 1820. Your family left Pennsylvania 6 weeks ago following the national road westward. Everything you own is in this wagon or the pack mule trailing behind it. Your father has a land grant certificate tucked in his coat pocket, 160 acres of virgin forest that will be yours if you can clear it, build a cabin, and farm it for 5 years. It sounds like a lot of land, and it is, but most of it is dense woodland that has to be cleared by hand. Pa, when will we get there? You ask as you help hitch the oxen to the wagon. 2 more days, God willing, he replies, squinting at the rising sun. Then the real work begins. The real work was back-breaking. Settlers had to clear forests with hand axes, pull stumps with teams of oxen, build cabins from the felled logs, and break the soil for planting, all before they could even think about growing food. And the isolation was crushing. Your nearest neighbour might be miles away. No doctors, no teachers, no community except what you could create from scratch. I haven't spoken to another woman in 3 months, a frontier wife writes in her diary. The silence is sometimes more than I can bear. Disease was rampant, malaria in the summer, pneumonia in the winter, childbirth without medical care. A simple cut could get infected and kill you in days. My Sarah died yesterday, a settler writes to his family back east. Childbed fever. The baby died with her. I buried them under the oak tree. Please tell mother I tried everything I knew. Not exactly the romanticized version of frontier life you see in movies, but people kept pushing west because the promise of land, their own land, was irresistible after generations of being landless laborers or tenant farmers in Europe or the eastern states. By 1820, the United States had 22 states, stretching as far west as Missouri. The population had nearly doubled since 1790, reaching about 9.6 million people, including nearly 1.8 million enslaved people. And that brings us to one of the darkest aspects of America's growth. As the country expanded westward, the institution of slavery expanded with it. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had made cotton production wildly profitable, and planters rushed to establish new plantations in the fertile lands of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. This created an insatiable demand for slave labor. We need 20 more hands for the new fields, a plantation owner tells his overseer as they survey freshly cleared land in Mississippi. The traders have a shipment coming from Virginia next month, the overseer replies. Good strong workers, they say. The plantation owner nods. Make sure we get our pick before the Johnsons. I hear they're expanding too. They're talking about human beings as if they're farm equipment. That's how thoroughly the system had dehumanized enslaved people. Meanwhile, the indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for thousands of years were being systematically pushed aside, killed, or forcibly relocated. Dawn breaks over a Cherokee village in northern Georgia. A tribal elder sits outside his cabin, watching the sun rise with troubled eyes. His grandson joins him. Grandfather, will we have to leave? The boy asks. He's heard the adults talking about the white settlers encroaching on their land. The old man is silent for a long moment. Our people have lived here since the time of the first stories, he finally says, but the white man's hunger for land is never satisfied. I fear dark days are coming. He was right. By the 1830s, most eastern tribes would be forcibly relocated to territories west of the Mississippi in what became known as the Trail of Tears. But that's getting ahead of our story. Back in Latin America, the newly independent nations were facing their own challenges. The wars of independence had devastated the economy. Infrastructure was in ruins. Political institutions were weak or non-existent. And perhaps most problematically, the social structure hadn't fundamentally changed. The Creole elites who led the revolutions simply replaced the peninsulares at the top of the hierarchy. Indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and poor mestizos saw little improvement in their daily lives. Bolívar, who had dreamed of a unified Spanish America, watched in dismay as Gran Colombia fractured into separate nations. Regional interests, personal ambitions, and the sheer difficulty of governing such a vast and diverse territory made his grand vision impossible. In 1830, sick and disillusioned, Bolívar died of tuberculosis. His last words reportedly were, "America is ungovernable. Those who have served the revolution have ploughed the sea." Pretty depressing final thought from a guy who liberated half a continent. The 1820s saw the emergence of a doctrine that would shape relations between the Americas and Europe for generations to come, the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, President James Monroe declared that the American continents were not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. In other words, Europeans, keep your hands off the Americas. It was a bold statement, considering the US didn't actually have the military power to enforce it at the time, but Britain, with its powerful navy, tacitly supported the policy because it helped keep their European rivals out of the Americas while still allowing British commercial dominance. For the newly independent Latin American nations, the Monroe Doctrine was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it helped protect them from European reconquest. On the other hand, it signaled the beginning of US hegemony in the hemisphere. The Americans say they protect us from Europe, a Colombian diplomat remarks to his Mexican counterpart over brandy in a Bogotá salon. But who will protect us from the Americans? His companion chuckles darkly. Perhaps we have merely traded one master for another who lives closer to home. Not like your cozy bed right now with no worries about independence movements or land-hungry neighbours, just the gentle sound of this story to carry you along. By 1825, the map of the Americas had been transformed. Where once there had been just a handful of European colonies, now there were many independent nations finding their way in the world. The Spanish Empire in the Americas, which had lasted for 3 centuries, had collapsed in less than 2 decades. The United States, meanwhile, was growing in population, territory, and confidence. The era of good feelings under President Monroe gave Americans a sense of national purpose and identity that transcended regional differences, at least temporarily. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. The question of slavery and its expansion into new territories would soon threaten to tear the young nation apart. And in Latin America, the hard realities of nation building were proving even more difficult than winning independence had been. For ordinary people throughout the Americas, daily life remained a struggle for survival. Whether you were a pioneer clearing land in Kentucky, a freed slave in Haiti trying to build a life after revolution, or an indigenous person in Mexico watching your world transform around you, the dawn of the 1820s brought both new opportunities and new challenges. The age of revolution was ending. The age of nation building was just beginning, and it would prove every bit as bloody and complex as the fight for independence had been. So here's the thing about revolutions. They're actually the easy part. No, seriously. Getting everyone fired up to overthrow the oppressor, that's step 1. Building a functioning country afterward, that's where shit gets real. By 1825, most of Latin America had won independence, but now came the headache of figuring out how to actually govern. And spoiler alert, it didn't go smoothly. Imagine waking up in Caracas in 1830. The streets that once rang with revolutionary slogans are now filled with more practical concerns. The economy is in shambles after years of war. The government changes every few months, and the great liberator, Simón Bolívar, is dying, his dream of a united Spanish America shattered. You make your way to the central market where prices for basic goods have tripled since independence. A woman argues with a vendor over the cost of cornmeal. 6 reals. 2 weeks ago it was 3. The vendor shrugs helplessly. The roads aren't safe. Bandits hit the last 2 shipments, and the new tax collector takes his cut too. A nearby soldier overhears and snorts. Tax collector? You mean Colonel Vargas's cousin who pockets half of what he collects? This was the reality across much of Latin America. Independence had created power vacuums, and into those vacuums stepped military strongmen called caudillos. These guys basically said, "I've got the guns, so I'm in charge now." One of these caudillos, Juan Manuel de Rosas of Argentina, ruled with an iron fist from 1829 to 1852. Rosas had this paramilitary group called La Mazorca that terrorized his political opponents. Not like, oh, they said mean things on Twitter. More like, they'll cut your throat in the street and leave your body as a warning to others. Did you hear what happened to Professor Echeverria? A university student whispers to his friend as they hurriedly walk through Buenos Aires. "They found him this morning," the friend replies, barely moving his lips. His tongue had been cut out. For a poem? They killed him for a poem? No, they killed him because Rosas can. That's the message. Both young men fall silent as a group of men wearing the red ribbons of Rosa's supporters passes by. That was the deal with caudillos. They maintained order, but at a terrible cost to civil liberties and democratic development, and they were everywhere. Antonio López de Santa Anna in Mexico, Rafael Carrera in Guatemala, Juan José Flores in Ecuador, Andrés Santa Cruz in Bolivia. Meanwhile, up north, the United States was going through its own growing pains, but with a big difference. Its governmental institutions were actually functioning. The peaceful transfer of power from one president to another was becoming routine, something that was decidedly not happening in Latin America. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected president, marking the beginning of what historians call Jacksonian democracy. Jackson styled himself as the champion of the common man against the elite, which is kind of ironic considering he owned slaves and was a wealthy plantation owner, but whatever. Imagine standing in the mud of Pennsylvania Avenue on March 4th, 1829, Jackson's inauguration day. The crowd is unlike anything seen before at a presidential inauguration. Instead of just the upper crust, thousands of ordinary citizens have come to see their president take office. Never seen so many common folk at one of these, a well-dressed Georgetown resident remarks disdainfully, lifting his polished boots from the muck. "Get used to it," replies a rough-hewn man in homespun clothing. "It's our government now." After the ceremony, Jackson opened the White House to the public for a reception. It turned into absolute chaos. People stood on furniture in muddy boots, broke china, grabbing for refreshments, and generally trashed the place. Jackson himself had to escape through a window. "My God," a Supreme Court justice exclaims, watching the mayhem from a corner. "The people are in power. This is mob rule." His companion, a European diplomat, looks bemused. "In my country, we fear the mob might storm the palace. Here, you invite them in for drinks." The Jackson era saw massive changes in American politics. Voting rights expanded for white men as property requirements were dropped. Political parties became more organized and campaigns more raucous. Democracy was getting rowdier and more inclusive if you were white and male, that is. For Native Americans, though, Jackson's presidency was nothing short of catastrophic. Jackson, the frontier Indian fighter, had built much of his reputation on conflicts with indigenous peoples, and he had his eye on their land. In Georgia, the Cherokee Nation had done everything the US government had asked of them. They had adopted farming, established schools, created a written language, drafted a constitution, and even owned slaves, adopting the practices of their white neighbors. Their newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, was published in both Cherokee and English. But none of that mattered when gold was discovered on their land in 1828. Georgia moved to strip the Cherokee of their territory, and Jackson supported them despite Supreme Court rulings in favor of Cherokee sovereignty. John Marshall has made his decision, Jackson reportedly said of the Chief Justice's ruling. Now let him enforce it. Spoiler alert, Marshall couldn't enforce it. The executive branch controls the army, not the judiciary. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the president authority to negotiate with southern tribes for their removal to federal territory west of the Mississippi River. Some went peacefully, seeing the writing on the wall. Others, like the Cherokee, fought through legal means, but ultimately lost. Dawn breaks cold and grey over a Cherokee village in Georgia. It's May 1838, and US soldiers are everywhere, rounding up families and forcing them into crude stockades. A Cherokee mother frantically stuffs a few possessions into a blanket as soldiers approach her cabin. 2 minutes, the sergeant barks. Take what you can carry. But our farm, our home, her husband begins. Not yours anymore, the sergeant cuts him off. A white family moves in next week. Get moving. The Cherokee were forced to march over 1,000 miles to present-day Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way from disease, exhaustion, and exposure. Similar forced relocations happened to the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Collectively, these brutal journeys became known as the Trail of Tears. I fought alongside Jackson against the British, an elderly Cherokee chief tells his grandson as they trudge westward. I saved white settlers during the Creek War, and this is how they repay us. The boy, thin from weeks of inadequate rations, looks up at him. Will we ever go home, grandfather? The old man looks away. Some questions are too painful to answer. While all this was happening, the American economy was transforming. The 1820s and 1830s saw the beginning of what historians call the market revolution, a shift from local subsistence farming to commercial agriculture and early industrialization. Imagine waking up in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1835. You're a young woman, a mill girl, who has left the family farm to work in the textile factories. The bell rings at 4:30 a.m., calling you to your 14-hour workday. You share a cramped company boarding house with a dozen other young women. The noise of the looms has already made you partially deaf at age 19. The cotton fibers in the air leave you constantly coughing, but you earn actual wages, about $3.50 a week, which gives you an independence your mother never dreamed of. Sometimes I think my lungs will burst from the dust, one mill girl writes to her sister back on the farm. But last week I bought a book of poetry with my own money. Can you imagine that? My own book purchased with money I earned myself. It wasn't just factories changing the economy. New canals and eventually railroads were shrinking the country, bringing distant markets closer together. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to New York City and the Atlantic, dramatically reducing the cost of shipping goods. But the market revolution didn't reach everywhere equally. The South remained primarily agricultural and increasingly committed to a single crop. Cotton, and cotton meant slavery. By 1840, the United States was producing 2/3 of the world's cotton, almost all of it grown and harvested by enslaved people. Cotton was America's leading export, and the labor of the enslaved was making the country rich. The latest figures show our cotton exports at $64 million last year, a Charleston merchant tells his colleagues at their private club. That's more than all other exports combined. And still the abolitionists prattle on about the immorality of our labour system, another man scoffs. I wonder if they consider the immorality of economic ruin. What would become of American trade without our cotton? What these men conveniently ignored was the human cost of that cotton. Enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset in brutal conditions. Families were routinely torn apart as planters sold off individuals to pay debts or maximize profits. Resistance was met with savage violence. Dawn breaks over a cotton plantation in Mississippi. The enslaved workers are already in the fields, backs bent under the already hot sun. An overseer on horseback watches their every move. "Move faster, Eli," he calls to an older man struggling to keep pace. "You're falling behind." "Sorry, massa," Eli says, his voice carefully neutral. "These old bones don't work like they used to." The overseer's whip cracks over Eli's back. "Then I'll give them some encouragement." That night, in the slave quarters, a young woman applies a poultice of herbs to Eli's lacerated back. "Why don't we run, Uncle Eli?" she whispers. "Head north to freedom?" Eli winces as the herbs sting his open wounds. 3 tried last month, caught by the dogs, 2 hanged, 1 sold downriver. Freedom's a long way from Mississippi, girl. Back in Latin America, the new nations were struggling with their own challenges. Political instability was endemic. Most countries cycled through multiple constitutions and governments in their first decades of independence. The exception was Brazil, which had taken a different path to independence. When Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1807, the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, effectively moving the capital of the empire to Rio de Janeiro. When they returned to Portugal in 1821, the king's son Pedro stayed behind and declared himself emperor of an independent Brazil the following year. This meant Brazil achieved independence without the devastating wars that ravaged Spanish America. It also meant Brazil remained a monarchy while its neighbours all became republics, at least on paper. But Brazil shared one crucial feature with the rest of Latin America, an economy built on slave labor. Brazil imported more enslaved Africans than any other American nation, nearly 5 million people over 3 centuries. Slavery wouldn't be abolished there until 1888, making it the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. Dawn breaks over a sugar plantation outside Bahia, Brazil. The enslaved workers are already cutting cane, their machetes flashing in the early light. The work is brutally hard, the sun merciless. A Portuguese overseer watches from the shade of a tree, occasionally shouting orders. Nearby, the plantation owner discusses business with a British merchant. "We can increase production by 20% this year," the owner says. "I've purchased 40 new Africans, strong ones." "Excellent," the British man replies. "London can't get enough of your sugar, though I should warn you there's increasing talk in Parliament about enforcing the ban on the slave trade." The plantation owner waves dismissively. "They've been talking for years. Meanwhile, the ships keep coming. Business is business." Indeed, Britain had outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, but continued to profit enormously from slave-produced goods. It was a moral compromise that allowed Britons to feel righteous while still reaping the economic benefits of slave labour. Mexico, meanwhile, was facing its own set of problems. After winning independence in 1821, the country had briefly been an empire under Agustin de Iturbide, then a republic, then effectively a dictatorship under Antonio López de Santa Anna, who served as president 11 different times between 1833 and 1855. But Mexico's biggest challenge was holding on to its vast northern territories, which were increasingly attracting American settlers, especially to the region known as Texas. In the 1820s, Mexico had actively encouraged American immigration to Texas, offering land grants to settlers who agreed to become Mexican citizens, convert to Catholicism, and obey Mexican law. Thousands of Americans took them up on the offer, led by impresarios, land agents, like Stephen F. Austin. But these American settlers never fully integrated into Mexican society. They kept their Protestant faith, their English language, and their American customs. And most problematically for Mexico, many brought slaves, despite the fact that Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. By 1835, there were about 30,000 American settlers in Texas, outnumbering Tejanos, Mexicans in Texas, by a ratio of 10-1. Conflict was inevitable. Imagine standing in the central plaza of San Antonio de Bexar, now just San Antonio, in October 1835. The town is tense with rumors of approaching Mexican troops. American settlers and some Tejanos who favor greater autonomy from the central government are preparing for confrontation. A rider gallops into town, pulling his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust. "Santa Anna's coming himself," he announces to the gathering crowd, "with an army of thousands, says he'll make no quarter for rebels." "Then we'll give him none in return," shouts a tall frontiersman, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. A Tejano rancher steps forward, his expression troubled. "I have no love for Santa Anna, but are we truly ready to break from Mexico, to start a war?" The American settler turns to him. "The war's already started, amigo. Santa Anna made sure of that when he threw out the Constitution of 1824. This was the Texian, Anglo-Texan view that Santa Anna had become a dictator by discarding the Federalist Constitution and centralizing power. From the Mexican perspective, the American settlers were ungrateful colonists who had accepted Mexican hospitality only to steal a massive chunk of national territory. Both sides had a point. The resulting Texas Revolution gave us the famous Battle of the Alamo in February-March 1836, where a small force of Texians and Tejanos held out for 13 days against Santa Anna's much larger army before being overrun and killed. The brutal nature of the defeat, Santa Anna ordered no prisoners taken, became a rallying cry. Remember the Alamo? 6 weeks later, Texian forces under Sam Houston surprised Santa Anna's army at San Jacinto, crushing them in a battle that lasted just 18 minutes and capturing Santa Anna himself. Under duress, Santa Anna signed treaties recognizing Texan independence. "You realize this isn't the end," a Mexican officer tells Houston after the Texian victory. "Mexico will never willingly surrender Texas." Houston looks out over the battlefield where hundreds of Mexican soldiers lie dead. "Your government may not accept it, but the facts on the ground have changed. Texas is free, whether Mexico acknowledges it or not." The Republic of Texas would remain an independent nation for nearly a decade before being annexed by the United States in 1845, a move that would directly lead to war between the US and Mexico. While Texas was fighting for independence, the United States faced a severe economic crisis. The Panic of 1837 began with a collapse in cotton prices, followed by a general financial meltdown that plunged the country into a depression that lasted until 1843. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. In a New York tenement, a family gathers around their meager dinner. a thin soup with a few vegetables. "Any luck today, Pa?" the eldest son asks his father. The man shakes his head, his eyes downcast. The docks were full of men looking for work, hundreds of us for just a few positions. "Tomorrow, I'll try the factories again." His wife touches his arm gently. "We still have the children's shoes to sell if things get worse." This depression highlighted a growing division in American society. While previous economic downturns had affected mostly merchants and investors, the increasingly interconnected market economy meant that this crisis hit workers hard. Labor activism grew as conditions worsened. By 1840, the American political landscape was dominated by two parties: the Democrats, heirs to Jackson's populist approach, and the Whigs, who favored a more activist federal government that would promote economic development through infrastructure projects and protective tariffs. The election that year saw the Whig candidate William Henry Harrison defeat the Democratic incumbent Martin Van Buren, who had been saddled with blame for the economic crisis. Harrison's campaign was notable for its use of symbols and slogans rather than substantive policy discussions, a harbinger of modern political marketing. They're calling Harrison the log cabin and hard cider candidate, a newspaper editor tells his assistant, as if he's some common frontiersman, not the son of a wealthy Virginia planter who lives on a 3,000-acre estate. "But it's working," the assistant points out. "People want to vote for someone they'd like to have a drink with, not a dandy in a fine coat." God help the Republic if that becomes the standard for choosing our leaders. Harrison won the election but served as president for just 1 month before dying of pneumonia, likely contracted during his long, rain-soaked inaugural address. His vice president, John Tyler, took office but quickly alienated his own party by vetoing much of their legislative agenda. By the mid-1840s, the United States and its neighbors stood at a crossroads. The American experiment in Republican government had survived its first half-century, but deep divisions remained, particularly over slavery and its expansion. The Latin American nations were still finding their footing, cycling through constitutions and leaders as they sought stability. And on the horizon loomed a concept that would dramatically reshape the continent: manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across North America would drive the next phase of continental development with momentous consequences for all the peoples of the Americas. Not like your cozy, peaceful bed right now. No territorial disputes or economic panics to worry about, just the gentle flow of history washing over you as you drift towards sleep. By 1845, a new phrase was on everyone's lips in America: manifest destiny. Coined by newspaper editor John O'Sullivan, it captured the growing belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the entire continent, spreading its institutions and civilization from Atlantic to Pacific. But let's be real about what manifest destiny actually meant. It wasn't just some lofty philosophical concept, it was a convenient justification for taking land from Mexico and Native Americans. It was an excuse wrapped in destiny, God, and progress. "It is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent," a politician declares to enthusiastic applause at a rally in St. Louis. Afterward, a farmer approaches him. "So God himself wants us to have California." The politician claps him on the shoulder. "My friend, the Almighty has been a good Democrat since the days of Jefferson." Manifest destiny went beyond political rhetoric. It tapped into something primal in the American psyche, this hunger for land, for opportunity, for movement. The idea of the frontier as a place of rebirth and reinvention had become central to American identity. But one man's destiny is another man's catastrophe. For Native Americans, it meant further displacement. For Mexico, it meant watching hungrily as American settlers poured into their northern territories. And for enslaved black Americans, it raised the terrifying prospect of slavery expanding into new lands. When President James K. Polk took office in 1845, he was determined to make Manifest Destiny a reality. Polk wanted Oregon, then jointly occupied by Britain and the US, and he wanted the Mexican territories of California and New Mexico, and he was willing to fight for them. The Oregon question was settled relatively peacefully. Britain and the US agreed to divide the territory at the 49th parallel, giving the US what would become Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, while Britain kept what would become British Columbia. Mexico was another story. In 1845, the US annexed Texas, which had been an independent republic for 9 years. Mexico had never recognized Texan independence and considered this an act of war. To make matters worse, Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern border, while Mexico insisted the boundary was the Nueces River further north. Polk sent troops under General Zachary Taylor into the disputed zone between the rivers. When Mexican forces attacked a U.S. patrol in April 1846, Polk had his pretext for war. American blood has been shed on American soil, Polk declared, conveniently ignoring that the American soil in question was actually disputed territory that had a pretty strong claim to being Mexican. Congress declared war, though not without opposition. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln demanded to know exactly where American blood had been shed, suspecting, correctly, that Polk had deliberately provoked the conflict. "Show me the spot," Lincoln demanded repeatedly, but most Americans were swept up in war fever, and Lincoln's objections were dismissed as unpatriotic. Imagine you're in a small village outside Mexico City in September 1847. For weeks, you've heard reports of the American army advancing toward the capital. Now the rumble of artillery can be heard in the distance. Your husband, a potter, has joined the local militia to defend the city. "Will the Americans kill us all?" your 7-year-old daughter asks as you hurriedly pack a few belongings. You try to smile reassuringly. "No, my love, they want our land, not our lives." "Then where will we live?" You have no answer for that. The Mexican-American War was relatively short, just under 2 years, but brutally one-sided. The US invaded from multiple directions, captured Mexico City, and forced Mexico to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February 1848. Mexico ceded more than half its territory, present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. The United States paid $15 million, which sounds like a bargain basement price for what would become some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. "We have taken away half their country," an American diplomat remarks to a colleague after the treaty signing. "They should be grateful we didn't take it all," his companion replies. "There were those who wanted to." For Mexicans living in the ceded territories, the treaty promised US citizenship and protection of property rights. In reality, many found their land claims challenged in American courts, their culture marginalized, and their new citizenship hollow. A Mexican landowner in California stares at the legal document informing him that his land grant, recognized for generations by Spanish and Mexican authorities, is being challenged in American courts. "But this land has been in my family since my grandfather's time," he protests to the American lawyer he's hired. "I have the papers." The lawyer sighs. "The court wants the originals in Spanish and English, with witnesses to verify every signature, and the proceedings will be in English, which you don't speak. How much will this cost me?" "More than most can afford." Thousands of Mexican landowners would lose their property through legal proceedings they couldn't navigate or afford to fight. But something else happened in early 1848 that would transform California more dramatically than the war itself. On January 24th, just 9 days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, a carpenter named James Marshall found gold flakes in the mill race at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. By the end of 1849, the California gold rush was in full swing. More than 100,000 people flooded into California from all over the world, from the eastern United States, Latin America, Europe, Australia, and China. San Francisco grew from a sleepy port of about 1,000 people to a boom town of 25,000 in just 2 years. Picture this: San Francisco Harbor, 1849. The bay is literally filled with abandoned ships, hundreds of them stretching to the horizon. Why abandoned? Because the entire crews, from captains to cabin boys, deserted to go search for gold the minute they docked. Some ships were later dragged ashore and turned into buildings. Others were left to rot. "I've never seen anything like it," a newly arrived merchant from Boston tells his companion as they survey the chaotic waterfront. "It's as if the rules of civilization have been suspended." His companion, a grizzled man who arrived 6 months earlier, laughs. "Rules? The only rule here is gold. Get it any way you can." Life in the gold fields was brutal. Most miners lived in makeshift canvas tents, worked in ice-cold streams all day, ate terrible food at outrageous prices, and rarely struck it rich. Disease was rampant. Violence was common. Indigenous people were massacred if they happened to be near where gold was found. "I've been at this for 8 months, a miner tells a newcomer, showing him how to work a pan in a freezing stream. "Found enough to keep going, not enough to go home." "Is it worth it?" asks the newcomer, his hands already blistered from the pan handle. The miner looks around at the mud, the crude tents, the hollow-eyed men. "Ask me again in a year if I'm still alive." For all the hardship and chaos, the gold rush transformed California. It became a state in 1850, just 2 years after being acquired from Mexico, skipping the usual territorial phase entirely. Its population exploded, its economy boomed, and its society became uniquely diverse, with people from all over the world thrown together in pursuit of instant riches. But California's admission to the Union raised a thorny political question. Would it be a free state or a slave state? California wanted to enter as a free state, which would upset the delicate balance between slave and free states that had kept the peace in Congress for decades. The solution was the Compromise of 1850, a package of 5 bills that admitted California as a free state, allowed the territories of New Mexico and Utah to decide the slavery question by popular sovereignty, ended the slave trade but not slavery in the District of Columbia, and created a tough, new Fugitive Slave Act requiring citizens in free states to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. This last provision infuriated Northerners who had previously been content to ignore the slavery issue. Now they were legally obligated to help return escaped human beings to bondage. Picture a small town in Ohio, 1851. A church meeting hall is packed with angry citizens. A local minister stands at the pulpit, his face flushed with indignation. "This law asks us to violate God's commandment to shelter the oppressed," he thunders. "It makes us agents of sin." A skeptic calls from the back, "But it's the law of the land. We can't just pick and choose which laws to follow." An older woman stands, her voice steady. "There is a higher law than any made in Washington, and I, for one, will answer to that higher law when my time comes." The Fugitive Slave Act radicalized many previously moderate Northerners, swelling the ranks of the abolitionist movement. It also inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that humanized enslaved people for many white readers and became a sensation when published in 1852. "Have you read this?" a Boston woman asks, holding up the book at a social gathering. "I wept for hours." "Pure abolitionist propaganda," scoffs a businessman. "Slander against the South." "Have you actually read it?" she challenges. He looks uncomfortable. "I don't need to read it to know what it says. Perhaps that's precisely why you should." While the political class was absorbed with these controversies, ordinary Americans were experiencing the first stirrings of what would later be called the Industrial Revolution. Factories were spreading in the Northeast, railroads were beginning to connect cities, and telegraph lines were creating the first instantaneous communication network in human history. Dawn breaks over a railroad construction site in Pennsylvania. Hundreds of workers, many of them Irish immigrants, are already swinging picks and shovels. The foreman, a harsh-faced man with a timepiece, watches their every move. "Sullivan," he barks at one laborer, "you're falling behind." The worker, his clothes ragged and face gaunt, picks up his pace. He arrived from Ireland just months ago, fleeing the devastating potato famine that killed 1 million people and forced 1 million more to emigrate. Like many Irish immigrants, he faced no Irish need apply signs until finding work on the railroads, where the brutal, dangerous labour made employers less picky. "How much longer on this section?" asks a well-dressed investor visiting the site. 3 weeks, weather permitting," the foreman replies. "We lose a few men a week to accidents, but there are always more looking for work." The investor nods, calculating profits in his head, not bodies. Railways were transforming America's sense of time and space. Journeys that had taken weeks by wagon now took days by train, but the human cost of this progress was steep. Railroad work was incredibly dangerous. Workers died in explosions, tunnel collapses, bridge failures, and equipment accidents. Meanwhile, in the South, life continued to be defined by agriculture, particularly cotton. By 1850, cotton made up nearly 60% of American exports. The South was supplying 75% of the world's cotton, almost all of it grown by enslaved labor. The immense profits from this white gold reinforced the South's commitment to slavery, even as the rest of the Western world moved toward abolition. Southern intellectuals, who had once apologetically described slavery as a necessary evil, now began defending it as a positive good for both enslaved people and society at large. Mourning on a cotton plantation in Alabama, 1852, an overseer moves between the rows of cotton plants, watching the enslaved workers pick the fluffy bolls and stuff them into large sacks dragged behind them. The summer sun is merciless. "You there, Bessie?" he calls to an older woman who has slowed her pace. "Pick faster or taste the whip." The woman doesn't look up, just moves her fingers more quickly through the cotton plants, ignoring the cuts from the sharp bowl casings. She's been doing this work for 40 years, since she was a child. Her back is permanently bent from decades of stooping. That night in the slave quarters, Bessie tells stories to the children, not about Africa, which she knows only from her grandmother's tales, but about freedom. "Someday," she whispers, "someday we won't be anyone's property. We'll work for ourselves, live for ourselves." A boy of about 7 looks up at her skeptically. "How you know that, Granny Bess?" She smiles mysteriously. "I just know. Now go to sleep. Tomorrow comes early." While the United States was expanding westward, Mexico was struggling to rebuild after its devastating defeat in the war. The loss of half its territory was a national trauma that still resonates in Mexican culture today. The war also exacerbated political divisions within Mexico, setting the stage for another period of civil conflict. In 1853, Santa Anna returned to power for the 11th and final time. Desperate for funds, he sold another chunk of what is now southern Arizona and New Mexico to the United States for $10 million in what became known as the Gadsden Purchase. This was the last major territorial acquisition in the continental United States. Meanwhile, in Central America, a fascinating drama was unfolding. An American adventurer named William Walker was attempting to establish his own personal empire through military force. In 1855, Walker led a small private army into Nicaragua, took advantage of a civil war there, and briefly made himself president. He reinstated slavery, which Nicaragua had abolished decades earlier, and dreamed of creating a slave-holding empire in Central America dominated by white Americans. Walker was eventually defeated by a coalition of Central American nations, aided by the British. He was executed by firing squad in Honduras in 1860, but his bizarre adventure highlighted the growing American interest in dominating the hemisphere, which would only intensify in the decades to come. Back in the United States, the fragile peace established by the Compromise of 1850 was about to be shattered. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which organized the Central Plains into the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing popular sovereignty to decide the slavery question in these territories. This meant slavery could potentially expand into areas where it had been prohibited for over 30 years. Anti-slavery forces were outraged. The act split the Democratic Party and gave birth to the new Republican Party, dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery into the territories. The stage was now set for a showdown between North and South over the future of slavery in America, and it would begin in Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery forces were about to turn a territory into a battleground. But that story, with all its blood and fire, will have to wait for now. Not like your warm, peaceful bed with no territorial disputes or slavery controversies to worry about. Just the gentle flow of history washing over you, carrying you toward sleep. In the span of just 9 years, from 1845 to 1854, the United States had physically transformed itself. It had expanded all the way to the Pacific, acquired vast territories from Mexico, discovered gold in California, built railroads linking east and west, and laid the foundations for the coming Industrial Revolution. But the nation had also sown the seeds of a catastrophic civil conflict. The question of slavery's expansion had moved from a political issue to a moral crusade. Compromise was becoming impossible, and the next decade would see whether the American experiment in self-government could survive its greatest test. When Senator Stephen Douglas pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress in 1854, he thought he was being clever. Let the people in each territory vote on whether to allow slavery. Democracy in action, right? What could possibly go wrong? Everything could go wrong. The ink was barely dry on the bill when both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers started pouring into Kansas, each side determined to win the vote. Except they weren't really interested in voting, they were interested in fighting. Free soilers coming in from Massachusetts, a pro-slavery settler warns his neighbors at a meeting in a Missouri border town, armed to the teeth and talking about making Kansas free. "Then we'll just have to be better armed," another man replies, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "I say we head over there and show them what Missourians think about that." These weren't empty threats. Pro-slavery Missourians crossed into Kansas in large numbers, many just to vote illegally in territorial elections, others to intimidate and attack anti-slavery settlers. They became known as border ruffians, and they helped pro-slavery forces win the first territorial elections, though the voting was so fraudulent it was basically meaningless. Anti-slavery settlers, meanwhile, set up their own rival government. By 1856, Kansas had 2 territorial capitals, 2 constitutions, and 0 chance of resolving things peacefully. The violence started small, a beating here, a burned cabin there. Then, in May 1856, a pro-slavery posse sacked the Free State town of Lawrence, destroying printing presses and looting homes. The response came from a figure who would become legendary in American history, though not in a good way, John Brown, an intense Old Testament-style abolitionist who believed God had chosen him to end slavery by any means necessary. 3 days after the sack of Lawrence, Brown led a small group, including 4 of his sons, to Pottawatomie Creek, where they dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their cabins in the middle of the night and hacked them to death with broadswords. Yes, broadswords. In 1856, a teenage boy stumbles through the pre-dawn darkness, his bare feet bloody from running through the woods. He pounds on the door of a neighbor's cabin. "Help!" he cries, his voice breaking with terror. They killed Pa and Mr. Doyle and his boys too. The cabin door opens a crack, a rifle barrel showing first. Who killed them? Old Brown and his sons. They had swords. They made Pa watch while they... The boy breaks down, sobbing. The man opens the door wider, pulling the boy inside. "Jesus Christ," he whispers, looking out at the darkness. "What kind of monsters are we dealing with?" The Pottawatomie Massacre, as it became known, kicked off a summer of guerrilla warfare in Kansas that left about 200 people dead. Newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas, which sounds like a nice, neat historical term now, but was literally describing blood soaking into prairie soil. But violence wasn't confined to the frontier. It reached into the hallowed halls of Congress itself. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, in which he insulted several pro-slavery senators, including Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Butler's cousin, Congressman Preston Brooks, decided family honor demanded satisfaction, but instead of challenging Sumner to a duel, as Southern code might normally dictate, Brooks decided Sumner wasn't worthy of that courtesy. Instead, he walked into the Senate chamber while Sumner was working at his desk and beat him nearly to death with a gold-headed walking stick. Sumner was so badly injured he couldn't return to the Senate for 3 years. Brooks received hundreds of replacement canes from admiring Southerners, many inscribed with phrases like "hit him again." The next morning, a congressman from Ohio confronts Brooks in the Capitol corridor. "What you did was the act of a coward," he says, his hand resting on the pistol in his coat pocket. "To strike a man unaware, seated at his desk." Brooks smirks. "The only language abolitionists understand is a good thrashing. Do you wish to defend Sumner's honor further?" The Northern congressman considers the armed Southern friends flanking Brooks. "This isn't over," he says finally, walking away. "It most certainly is not," Brooks calls after him. The caning of Sumner showed just how dangerously divided the nation had become. Northerners were horrified by the attack. Southerners largely celebrated it. The two sections of the country were no longer seeing the same reality. While America was tearing itself apart over slavery, Latin America was going through its own transformations. In Mexico, liberals led by Benito Juárez were fighting conservatives in the Reform War, 1857-1861, a struggle over the power of the Catholic Church, indigenous rights, and land reform. Dawn breaks over Mexico City in 1858. A woman kneels in prayer in a small chapel, her rosary moving through her fingers. Outside, gunfire echoes sporadically. A priest enters, his expression grim. "Senora Mendoza, you should go home. The liberal forces are advancing into the city." And if they take the city, Father, what then? They will confiscate church lands, close monasteries and convents. They say the church has too much power. She crosses herself. These are dark times. The priest nods solemnly. Pray for Mexico. We are tearing ourselves apart. Meanwhile, far to the south, Argentina was finally unifying after decades of civil conflicts between Federalists and Unitarians. In 1861, Buenos Aires would reluctantly join the Argentine Confederation, creating the roughly unified Argentina we know today. In Brazil, still an empire under Dom Pedro II, coffee was becoming the dominant export, replacing sugar. This shifted economic power from the northeast to the south, particularly São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro provinces. Brazil's economy was still heavily dependent on slavery, though pressure to abolish the institution was growing. Back in the United States, the Supreme Court was about to drop a bombshell that would further inflame the slavery controversy. In March 1857, it issued its ruling in the case of Dred Scott versus Sandford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had been taken by his owner to live in Illinois, a free state, and Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was prohibited. After his owner's death, Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that residence on free soil had made him free. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, a Maryland slave owner, ruled that 1. Black people were not citizens and had no right to sue in federal court. 2. Living in free territory didn't make Scott free because the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. 3. Slave owners could take their property anywhere in the United States without losing ownership rights. It was everything the South had ever wanted, and the North's worst nightmare. A group of businessmen huddles around a newspaper in a Chicago office, reading the decision with increasingly grim expressions. "This can't stand," one says finally. "They've basically ruled that slavery can go anywhere, and that no black person, free or slave, has any rights," another adds. "The court says they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect." Those exact words. An older man shakes his head. "Gentlemen, we are watching the Constitution being twisted to strangle freedom. The question is what we do about it." The newest political party, the Republicans, knew exactly what to do about it: gain power and curb slavery's expansion. They found their voice in an unlikely figure, Abraham Lincoln, a prairie lawyer from Illinois who had served one unremarkable term in Congress a decade earlier. In 1858, Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas for his Senate seat. As part of their campaign, they held 7 debates focused largely on slavery. Lincoln didn't advocate immediate abolition, which was still a radical position, but argued that slavery should be put on a course toward eventual extinction by preventing its spread into new territories. During the 6th debate in a town called Quincy, Lincoln stands before a crowd of thousands in the crisp autumn air. "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," he declares. "I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." Later, a farmer approaches Lincoln as he comes down from the platform. "You really believe the Negro is equal to the white man?" he asks skeptically. Lincoln regards him thoughtfully. "In the right to eat the bread his own hands have earned, he is the equal of any man, white or black. In other respects, our opinions may differ, but can we not agree that no man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent?" Lincoln lost that Senate race, but the debates made him nationally famous. Meanwhile, tensions continued to escalate. In October 1859, John Brown, the same man who had murdered pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. His plan was to seize weapons and spark a slave uprising across the South. The raid failed miserably. Brown was captured, tried for treason, and hanged on December 2, 1859, but his raid terrified the South and electrified the North, where many viewed him as a martyr. At his execution, Brown handed a note to his guard that read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." It was a prophetic statement. The 1860 presidential election took place in this atmosphere of mutual fear and suspicion. The Democratic Party split into northern and southern wings, each with their own candidate. A new constitutional union party emerged to offer a middle path, and the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln, who wasn't even on the ballot in most southern states. Lincoln won with just 40% of the popular vote, but a solid majority in the Electoral College. Before he could even take office, southern states began to secede from the Union. First to go was South Carolina on December 20th, 1860. By February 1861, 6 more had followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They formed the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis as their president, and began seizing federal forts and arsenals within their borders. In Charleston, South Carolina, a crowd gathers outside the newspaper office on the evening of December 20th, waiting for news. A man emerges onto the balcony, waving a document. "The Ordinance of Secession has been signed," he shouts. "South Carolina is a free and independent commonwealth." Cheers erupt from the crowd. Church bells begin to ring across the city. A group of men fire pistols into the air. In the shadows across the street, an enslaved man watches silently, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. A white man jostles past him, nearly knocking him down. "Watch yourself, boy," the man snarls. "Things are changing around here." "Yes, massa," the enslaved man replies, eyes downcast. But when the white man moves on, he looks up again, watching the celebration with calculating eyes. Yes, things are changing, he thinks, perhaps in ways these celebrating men cannot imagine. President James Buchanan, a Northern Democrat with Southern sympathies, did virtually nothing to stop secession during his final months in office. He claimed he had no constitutional authority to coerce states back into the Union. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, 7 states had seceded, formed their own government, and seized most federal properties in their territories, except for a few key forts. The most important of these was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. In his inaugural address, Lincoln appealed for patience and peace, but also made it clear he would not accept secession. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But the bonds were already broken. A month later, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, forcing its surrender after a 34-hour bombardment. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. 4 more states seceded rather than contribute troops to fight their southern neighbors: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The Civil War had begun. For all the high-minded talk about states' rights and constitutional principles, the everyday reality for most Americans in the 1850s was far more mundane. They were focused on survival, family, and community. Imagine waking up in a small farmhouse in Illinois in 1855. It's still dark, but the roosters are crowing. You're a farm wife, and your day begins before anyone else's. You stir the banked coals in the cook stove, add kindling, and start breakfast for your husband and 5 children. Cornmeal mush. Maybe some salt pork if you're not saving it for winter. Coffee if you can afford it, or chicory if you can't. Your husband comes in from milking the cow, the cold still clinging to his clothes. "Looks like snow coming," he says, hanging his hat by the door. "We've got enough wood chopped, you ask, though you know the answer. Should last through the week. Boys and I will cut more today." The children tumble in, sleep still in their eyes. The oldest, 12, has already fed the chickens. The younger ones crowd around the stove for warmth before sitting at the table. Your day stretches ahead of you. Cooking, cleaning, washing, mending, preserving food, making soap, tending the garden, caring for the children. You'll be lucky to sit down before dark, but farm families were actually a shrinking portion of the population. By 1860, cities were growing rapidly. New York City had over 800,000 people. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, New Orleans, St. Louis, all were becoming major urban centers. Urban life had its own rhythms, especially for the working class. Imagine a tenement apartment in New York's Five Points neighborhood, one of the most notorious slums in America. A family of Irish immigrants, parents and 6 children, share 2 small rooms with another family. Privacy is non-existent. The building has no running water, no toilet. The streets outside are filled with garbage. Disease is constant. The father works as a day labourer when he can find work, which isn't often given the "No Irish Need Apply" signs in most shop windows. The mother takes in washing. The oldest children, even as young as 8, work in factories or sell newspapers on the street corners. I made 30 cents today, a boy announces proudly, placing the coins in his father's calloused palm. His father's face softens. "Good lad, that'll help with the rent." "Can we have meat tonight?" asks his younger sister hopefully. The mother exchanges a glance with her husband. "Not tonight, love, but Sunday, if we're careful with what we have." While these families, both rural and urban, might debate politics at church or in taverns, most were too consumed with daily survival to participate actively in the great issues of the day. Yet their lives would be profoundly affected by the coming conflict. In the South, white society was sharply divided by class, despite the myth of Southern unity that would later emerge. About 3/4 of white Southerners owned no slaves at all. Of those who did, most owned fewer than 5. The planter elite, those owning 20 or more enslaved people, made up just 3% of the white population, but dominated Southern politics, economics, and culture. Non-slave-owning whites often resented the planter elite, but feared the prospect of freed black people even more. They could be persuaded that their interests aligned with wealthy planters against northern aggressors who threatened the southern way of life. For enslaved black people, who made up about 1/3 of the South's population, the 1850s brought both heightened repression and glimmers of hope. The Fugitive Slave Act made escape more difficult. The Dred Scott decision crushed legal avenues to freedom. But the growing abolitionist movement and the increasingly open conflict over slavery suggested that the peculiar institution might not last forever. On a cotton plantation in Mississippi, an enslaved man named Moses teaches his son to pick cotton in the brutal summer heat. The overseer is at the far end of the field. "Don't look him in the eye," Moses says quietly, nodding toward the overseer. "Don't ever let them think you're challenging them." "Yes, Papa," the boy whispers. "But don't you ever believe you're less than them either," Moses continues, his voice barely audible above the insects buzzing in the cotton plants. "God made us all the same, no matter what they say." The boy nods solemnly, filing this dangerous knowledge away. At sunset, when the workday finally ends, Moses and his son trudge back to the slave quarters. They pass the big house where the planter's family is sitting down to dinner, served by enslaved house servants. The contrast between their lives could not be more stark. But change was coming. The election of Lincoln, the secession of southern states, the rhetoric of conflict on both sides, all pointed toward an approaching storm. Few could have predicted just how devastating that storm would be. Not like your peaceful bed right now with no sectional conflicts to worry about, just the gentle sound of history moving inexorably toward its most violent chapter as you drift closer to sleep. When the Civil War began in April 1861, both sides expected a quick, decisive victory. This war will be over by Christmas, people said confidently, North and South. They were spectacularly wrong. Instead, America stumbled into the first truly modern industrialized war, and it was a goddamn nightmare. By the time it ended 4 years later, over 750,000 soldiers were dead, along with an unknown number of civilians. That's more American military deaths than all other US wars combined, from the Revolution through Korea. On a hot July day in 1861, well-dressed civilians from Washington, D.C. ride out in carriages to watch the first major battle at Bull Run, or Manassas as the Southerners called it. They bring picnic baskets and opera glasses, expecting to see a glorious spectacle and quick Union victory. I told Henry we simply must witness history being made, a woman in a fashionable bonnet tells her companion as their carriage bumps along the road to Manassas. Though I do hope we're not too late. The papers say our boys will make quick work of these rebels. By sunset, these same spectators are fleeing in terror as defeated Union troops stream back toward Washington in disarray. "My God, they're running," a congressman exclaims, standing up in his carriage for a better view. "Our army is actually running away." A shell explodes nearby, sending his horses into a panic. The carriage overturns, throwing its occupants into the dusty road, now clogged with retreating soldiers, abandoned equipment, and terrified civilians. "The rebels are coming," someone shouts, and the crowd surges in renewed panic. That first battle shocked both sides into realizing this would be no 90-day war. The Union settled in for a long struggle to bring the South back, while the Confederacy prepared to defend its claimed independence. Militarily, the war unfolded in two main theaters. In the Eastern Theater, centered on Virginia, Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia repeatedly thwarted Union attempts to capture Richmond, the Confederate capital. In the Western Theater, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant gradually secured control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. The war transformed not just the map, but the very nature of warfare. Railroads moved troops and supplies with unprecedented speed. Telegraph lines allowed real-time communication over vast distances. Improved weapons, especially rifled muskets, made battlefields deadlier than ever before. And the scale was enormous. Armies of over 100,000 men clashing in campaigns that stretched across hundreds of miles. For soldiers, the experience was simultaneously boring and terrifying. They spent most of their time marching, digging, and waiting. Disease killed far more men than bullets. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and pneumonia ravaged both armies. A Union soldier sits in a muddy camp near Fredericksburg, writing by candlelight in a small notebook. "Third day of rain," he scribbles. "Dysentery still bad. Jackson died last night. We buried him this morning, the 10th man from our company this month, and we haven't even seen the Rebs yet." He pauses, listening to the coughing from nearby tents, wondering how many more will be gone by morning. "Ma always said I'd die of stubbornness," he continues writing, a grim smile crossing his face. "Looks like I'll prove her wrong and die of the shits instead." The battles themselves were scenes of industrial slaughter. At Antietam in September 1862, nearly 23,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day, still the bloodiest day in American history. At Gettysburg in July 1863, the three-day battle left over 50,000 casualties. Imagine the aftermath of Gettysburg. The summer heat has accelerated decomposition of thousands of corpses. The stench can be smelled from miles away. Swarms of flies blacken the air. Hastily dug mass graves dot the landscape, many with hands or feet still protruding from the earth. "I thought I knew what hell was," a local farmer tells a reporter surveying the aftermath. "I was wrong. Hell is here, in Pennsylvania." A surgeon, his sleeves stiff with dried blood after 3 days of non-stop amputations, lights a cigarette with trembling hands. "We've run out of chloroform," he says flatly, "and clean bandages and fresh water, but the wounded keep coming." The Civil War wasn't just fought on famous battlefields, it reached into every aspect of American life. The Union blockaded southern ports, crippling the Confederate economy. Guerrilla warfare raged in Missouri and Kansas. Freed and escaped slaves joined the Union Army in growing numbers after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Speaking of which, let's talk about that Emancipation Proclamation. It's one of the most misunderstood documents in American history. Here's what it didn't do: immediately free all slaves everywhere in America. In fact, it technically didn't free any slaves in areas under Union control, including the border states that remained in the Union. What it did do was declare that all enslaved people in areas still in rebellion, i.e. the Confederacy, shall be thenceforward and forever free. Since those areas weren't under Union control, the immediate practical effect was limited, but it fundamentally changed the character of the war, making the abolition of slavery an explicit Union war aim, and it opened the door for black men to join the Union Army. By war's end, about 180,000 black men had served in the Union forces, making up nearly 10% of the Union Army. They fought with distinction, despite receiving lower pay than white soldiers initially, and facing the risk of execution or enslavement if captured by Confederate forces. "They say we won't fight," a black sergeant tells his company before their assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, "that we ain't men enough. Today we prove them wrong. Today we fight not just for ourselves, but for all our brothers and sisters still in chains." Half his company would die in the assault, including the sergeant himself, shot through the heart while carrying the fallen American flag forward. While America tore itself apart, events elsewhere in the hemisphere continued to unfold. The most dramatic was happening in Mexico, where a new foreign intervention was underway. In 1861, Mexico, under President Benito Juárez, suspended payment on its foreign debts due to financial crisis. In response, Britain, Spain, and France sent forces to occupy Veracruz and collect their money. Britain and Spain soon withdrew after negotiations, but France, under Emperor Napoleon III, saw an opportunity. Napoleon III had ambitions to establish a French empire in the Americas. With the United States distracted by civil war, he invaded Mexico, captured Mexico City, and installed Austrian Archduke Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico in 1864. Maximilian wasn't actually a bad guy. He was liberal for his time, genuinely wanted to help Mexico, and even offered Juárez a position in his government. Juárez refused. But he was still a foreign puppet imposed by military force, and Mexicans weren't having it. "What is your opinion of our new emperor?" a merchant asks a farmer at a market outside Mexico City. The farmer looks around carefully before responding in a low voice. "He is like the finest imported suit placed on a corpse. No matter how beautiful the garment, it cannot bring the dead to life." "And Mexico is the corpse?" A country ruled by foreigners against its will is not truly alive, amigo. Juarez and his Republican forces continued to resist, fighting a guerrilla campaign against the French. The United States, once the Civil War ended, began supplying Juarez with weapons and issuing stern warnings to the French. Back in the United States, the war had reached its bloody climax. By 1864, Grant's strategy of attrition was gradually wearing down Lee's army in Virginia, while General William Tecumseh Sherman was cutting a destructive swath through Georgia on his infamous march to the sea. Sherman's march embodied a new philosophy of total war that targeted not just enemy armies, but the entire economic and social system that supported them. His troops destroyed railroads, burned crops, killed livestock, and freed slaves across a 60-mile-wide path from Atlanta to Savannah. "We are not only fighting hostile armies," Sherman explained, "but a hostile people, and must make them feel the hard hand of war." An enslaved woman watches from hiding as Sherman's troops burn the plantation where she has lived all her life. The big house is in flames, the cotton gin destroyed, the smokehouses emptied of meat. A Union soldier spots her and approaches. "You're free now," he tells her. "You can come with us if you want." She looks at the destruction around her, the only home she's ever known reduced to ashes. "And where would I go? What would I do?" The soldier has no good answer for her. Freedom was precious, but it came with terrible uncertainties for people who had been denied education, property, and basic rights their entire lives. The Confederate war effort finally collapsed in April 1865. Richmond fell to Union forces. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. The remaining Confederate armies capitulated over the next few weeks. Just as the nation began to process its hard-won peace, tragedy struck. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theatre in Washington. Lincoln died the next morning, making Andrew Johnson, his vice president, the new president. Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, had none of Lincoln's moral compass or political skill. He would prove disastrously inadequate to the monumental task of Reconstruction. And what a task it was. The South lay in ruins. Cities like Atlanta, Columbia, and Richmond had been largely destroyed. Railroads, bridges, and factories were wrecked. The Confederate currency was worthless. Over a quarter of Southern white men of military age were dead, disabled, or missing. And 4 million formerly enslaved people were now free but with no land, no education, few legal protections, and surrounded by a defeated white population that largely resented their liberation. "Freedom is what?" an elderly black man asks a Union officer distributing Emancipation Proclamation notices in rural Mississippi. "It means you're not property anymore," the officer explains. "You can't be bought or sold. You can move freely, work for wages, marry legally." The old man considers this. "And the land? We get land?" "No, I'm afraid not. The government isn't confiscating or redistributing land. So we're free to work for the same massa who owned us yesterday on the same land just for wages now." "That's essentially correct, yes." The old man shakes his head. "Don't seem like much of a freedom to me." This exchange gets at one of the core failures of Reconstruction, the failure to provide an economic foundation for black freedom through land distribution. There was briefly hope with Special Field Order No. 15, which set aside confiscated coastal land from South Carolina to Florida for freed people in 40-acre plots. By June 1865, around 40,000 freed people had settled on these lands. But after Lincoln's assassination, President Johnson ordered almost all the land returned to its former white owners, forcing black families to leave land they had already begun cultivating. Despite these challenges, black Americans seized the opportunities available to them during Reconstruction. They established churches and schools, entered politics, started businesses, and reunited families separated by slavery. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, guaranteed citizenship rights, and prohibited racial discrimination in voting. For a brief, imperfect moment, multiracial democracy flowered in the South. Over 1,500 black men held public office during Reconstruction, including 16 congressmen and 2 senators. Southern state legislatures, now including black representatives, passed progressive legislation, establishing public education, expanding women's rights, and investing in public infrastructure. White Southerners, particularly former Confederate leaders and wealthy planters, were horrified by these developments. They founded terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan to intimidate black voters and their white Republican allies. Night falls on a small town in Alabama, 1868. A black family huddles in their cabin as hoofbeats approach. "Blow out the lamp," the father whispers urgently. "Everyone be silent." Outside, white hooded figures carry torches and rifles. They stop at a neighbor's house, a black man recently elected to the county commission. "Come out, Sanders," one calls. "We know you're in there." When Sanders appears in the doorway, they drag him out. His wife's screams echo through the night. The next morning, Sanders' body is found hanging from an oak tree in the town square, a warning to any black person who dared participate in politics. Such terrorism was widespread and effective. The federal government occasionally intervened to suppress it, but never with sufficient force or consistency to end it. Meanwhile, Northern commitment to Reconstruction was waning. The economic depression of 1873 shifted attention to other concerns. Corruption scandals in the Grant administration undermined the moral authority of Republicans. And many white Northerners simply grew tired of the Southern question and wanted reconciliation with white Southerners. The final blow came with the contested presidential election of 1876. Democrat Samuel Tilden won the popular vote, but Republican Rutherford B. Hayes needed just one more electoral vote to win. In the Compromise of 1877, Southern Democrats agreed to accept Hayes's election in exchange for the withdrawal of the last federal troops from the South and an end to federal enforcement of black civil rights. Reconstruction was over. What followed in the South was called redemption by white Southerners, the restoration of white supremacy through violence, intimidation, and legal disenfranchisement of black citizens. The Jim Crow era had begun and would last for nearly a century. While the United States was navigating its post-war reality, events elsewhere in the hemisphere were reaching their own turning points. In Mexico, the French adventure was collapsing. With the Civil War over, the United States could turn its attention south and began applying diplomatic pressure and supplying weapons to Juarez's forces. Napoleon III, facing the rise of Prussia in Europe, withdrew French troops in 1866. Maximilian refused to abdicate, believing mistakenly that he still had Mexican support. He was captured by Republican forces, court-martialed and executed by firing squad on June 19, 1867. Before the fatal shots, Maximilian stands blindfolded against a wall, dignified to the end. "May my blood be the last to be spilled for Mexico's good," he says. "Long live Mexico." The officer in charge of the firing squad, a man who has fought French occupation for years, feels an unexpected pang of respect for the foreign emperor's courage, but he gives the order anyway. Mexico will be ruled by Mexicans again. Juarez returned to power and began rebuilding, but Mexico's troubles were far from over. Years of war had devastated the economy and deepened political divisions. After Juarez's death in 1872, Porfirio Diaz eventually emerged as the dominant figure. He would rule Mexico as a dictator for most of the period from 1876 to 1911, bringing stability and economic growth at the cost of political freedom and increasing inequality. Across Latin America, similar patterns were emerging. Strong, often autocratic leaders brought a measure of stability after decades of post-independence chaos. Foreign investment, particularly from Britain, poured in to build railroads, develop mines, and establish export-oriented agricultural enterprises. But this economic progress often came at a steep social cost. Indigenous lands were seized for commercial development. Debt peonage replaced slavery as a method of controlling rural labour, and political power remained concentrated in the hands of small, wealthy elites. Not like your comfortable bed right now, where you can sleep without worrying about political instability or economic exploitation. Just the gentle flow of history continuing its course, carrying you toward deeper relaxation. By the late 1870s, America was done with the whole Reconstruction thing. The North and South had officially reconciled, which basically meant white America collectively agreed to forget about those pesky civil rights for black people and move on to making money. Lots and lots of money. Welcome to the Gilded Age, named by Mark Twain to describe something that looked golden and shiny on the outside, but was actually made of cheaper material underneath. Pretty perfect description for America between 1877 and 1900. This was the era of the robber barons, obscenely wealthy industrialists who built massive business empires, often through ruthless and questionable means. Guys like John D. Rockefeller, who created Standard Oil and controlled 90% of America's oil refining. Andrew Carnegie, whose steel company produced more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. J.P. Morgan, who could single-handedly stop financial panics by deciding which companies would survive and which wouldn't. Do you know what Morgan did yesterday? A Wall Street broker whispers to his colleague over lunch at Delmonico's in New York, called all the top bankers to his library, locked the doors, and wouldn't let them leave until they agreed to his plan to save the financial markets. His friend looks skeptical. One man shouldn't have that kind of power. One man does have that kind of power, and he's not even an elected official. The wealth these men accumulated was staggering, especially compared to their workers. When Carnegie sold his company to J.P. Morgan in 1901, he personally received $480 million, equivalent to about $15 billion today. Meanwhile, the average industrial worker made $500 a year, working 60-hour weeks in dangerous conditions. This enormous wealth gap bred labour unrest. Workers began organising into unions, demanding better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. The response from companies was often brutal. The most notorious clash came in 1892 at Carnegie's Homestead Steel Works near Pittsburgh. When workers struck over wage cuts, the company sent in 300 Pinkerton detectives, basically a private mercenary army, to break the strike. A gun battle broke out, leaving 16 people dead. The governor of Pennsylvania then sent in the state militia to protect strikebreakers, crushing the union. Picture this. Dawn at the Homestead Mill. Striking workers and their families have set up a tent city outside the gates. Suddenly, someone spots barges coming up the Monongahela River. Pinkertons, a lookout shouts. They're bringing in Pinkertons. Men grab rifles and pistols. Women hustle children to safety. As the barges dock, a shot rings out, though no one later could say from which side. Within minutes, it's a full-scale battle. A steel worker crouches behind a pile of scrap metal, reloading his hunting rifle. Next to him, a man takes a bullet to the throat and collapses, gurgling blood. "Jesus Christ," the steel worker whispers. "We just wanted fair wages." This conflict between capital and labor would define much of American society for decades. But while these dramatic events made headlines, the bigger story was the sheer pace of industrial growth. Between 1870 and 1900, America's rail network grew from 53,000 to 193,000 miles. Coal production increased from 33 million to 270 million tons. Steel production exploded from 77,000 to 11.4 million tons. The nation overtook Britain as the world's leading industrial power. All this industrial might needed raw materials and markets, which fueled westward expansion. Native Americans, who had survived centuries of European settlement, now faced their final catastrophic defeats. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led 267 men of the 7th Cavalry into battle against thousands of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors at Little Bighorn in Montana. The native forces, led by chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, wiped out Custer and his men in what became known as Custer's Last Stand. It was a stunning victory for the Native Coalition, and their last major one. The US government doubled down on its efforts to subdue the Plains tribes, pursuing relentless campaigns through the late 1870s. The buffalo herds, essential to Plains Indian culture and survival, were deliberately exterminated, going from millions to just a few hundred by the 1880s. "Look," a Lakota elder tells his grandson as they stand on a ridge overlooking the prairie. "What do you see?" The boy squints into the distance. "Nothing, grandfather." Exactly. 10 winters ago, the buffalo covered these plains like a black blanket. You could not see the ground between them. Now, he gestures at the empty landscape. This is how they defeat us, not with guns alone, but by destroying what sustains us. The final act of this tragedy came on December 29, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, surrounded a band of freezing, starving Lakota. During the process of disarming them, a shot was fired. The soldiers opened up with rifles and even Hotchkiss guns, killing at least 150 Lakota, mostly women and children. A blizzard swept in after the massacre. When it cleared days later, photographers captured images of the frozen bodies being collected for burial in a mass grave, a grim coda to 4 centuries of conflict between Native Americans and European settlers. By 1890, the US Census Bureau declared the frontier officially closed. There were no longer large areas of unsettled land. The continent-spanning nation that had begun as 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic coast was now filled in from sea to shining sea. Well, filled in if you didn't count the many Native American reservations which were being steadily whittled down as valuable resources were discovered on them. The Dawes Act of 1887 tried to force Native Americans to assimilate by breaking up reservation lands into individual plots and selling the surplus to white settlers. Over the next 50 years, Native Americans would lose about 2/3 of their remaining lands. While America was experiencing its industrial revolution, similar processes were unfolding across Latin America, though with important differences. Rather than developing diverse industrial economies, most Latin American countries specialized in exporting 1 or 2 raw materials. Coffee from Brazil and Colombia, beef and wheat from Argentina, silver from Mexico, tin from Bolivia, copper from Chile. This export-oriented model created enclaves of modernity, particularly in capital cities, surrounded by traditional rural areas that remained largely unchanged. Foreign investment, mainly British but increasingly American, poured in to build railroads, ports and mines that would facilitate getting these raw materials to world markets. Buenos Aires in the 1880s was being transformed into the Paris of South America. Grand boulevards, elegant theatres and European-style architecture reflected Argentina's new wealth as the world's leading beef exporter. An English businessman walks along Calle Florida. Buenos Aires's fashionable shopping street with a local rancher who has come to the city on business. "Your capital is quite impressive," the Englishman remarks. "I hardly feel I've left Europe." The Argentine laughs. That's precisely the goal. Our elites want nothing more than to forget we're in South America. But drive 20 miles outside the city and you'll see a very different Argentina. This different Argentina and the different Brazil, Chile, Peru and so on was where the vast majority of Latin Americans lived. Indigenous peasants, former slaves and their descendants, and mixed-race workers provided the labour that generated wealth but received few of its benefits. In Brazil, slavery was finally abolished in 1888, the last country in the Americas to do so. The following year, the Brazilian Empire fell, replaced by a republic dominated by coffee planters and urban professionals. For the 4 million formerly enslaved people, however, freedom brought little immediate improvement in living conditions. No land was distributed, no compensation provided, no meaningful political rights granted. Dawn breaks over a coffee plantation in São Paulo province. Former slaves, now working as poorly paid labourers, move through the rows of coffee plants just as they did before emancipation. An older man straightens his aching back and wipes sweat from his brow. "Freedom, they called it," he mutters to his son working beside him. "Feels the same as before, just with a few centavos at the end of the week." "At least they can't sell mama away from us now," his son points out, "or whip us legally." The old man nods slowly. "Small mercies, I suppose, but a piece of land of our own, that would have been real freedom." Throughout Latin America, modernization reinforced existing inequalities rather than disrupting them. The export boom enriched a small elite with connections to foreign capital, while indigenous communities often lost lands to expanding commercial agriculture and mining operations. In Mexico, the long dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, 1876 to 1911, brought stability and economic growth after decades of chaos. Foreign investment poured in, railroads expanded, and exports boomed. But this progress came at a steep social cost. Communal indigenous lands were declared vacant and sold to wealthy hacienda owners and foreign companies. Debt peonage, a form of labour control just shy of slavery, kept rural workers tied to haciendas, and political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Order and progress was Diaz's slogan, and he definitely delivered the order part. Critics joked darkly, for the rich, progress, for the poor, order. Back in the United States, the late 19th century saw massive waves of immigration, primarily from southern and eastern Europe. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants arrived in America. They provided the labor that fueled industrial growth, but faced discrimination and difficult conditions. Imagine Ellis Island in New York Harbor, 1890. A steamship from Naples has just arrived. Hundreds of Italian immigrants crowd the processing center, exhausted after their transatlantic journey in steerage. A young woman clutches her 2 small children, trying to keep them quiet as they wait in the seemingly endless line. Her husband had come to America 3 years earlier and finally saved enough for their passage. Name? the immigration officer asks when they finally reach the desk. Lucia Esposito, she replies in halting English practiced during the journey. Age? 26 years. Occupation? She hesitates, not understanding. Work? Job? The officer tries, impatient with the language barrier. Sartor. Sew clothes, she manages. The officer stamps her papers. Next. Within hours, they're in a tenement apartment in Manhattan's Lower East Side. One room shared with another family, no running water, a toilet in the hallway shared by 20 people. But it's America, where her husband says opportunities exist that would be impossible in the impoverished Italian South. These immigrants clustered in urban ethnic enclaves, Little Italy's Polish neighborhoods, Jewish quarters. They took the hardest, lowest-paying jobs, saved carefully, and gradually worked toward a better life for their children. But they also faced nativist hostility, discrimination, and exploitation. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act became the first significant law restricting immigration to the United States, prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers after decades of anti-Chinese agitation, particularly in California. It marked the beginning of an era of increasing immigration restrictions. All this economic and demographic change was accompanied by significant technological innovation. By 1900, American cities were being transformed by electricity, telephones, automobiles, and other modern technologies. In rural areas, though, life remained largely pre-industrial. Most farms still lacked electricity, indoor plumbing, and phone service. Rural isolation was profound, broken only by occasional trips to town or visits from travelling salesmen and mail-order catalogues. This rural-urban divide fueled the populist movement of the 1890s as farmers organised against what they saw as exploitation by railroads, banks and commodity traders. The populists called for inflation of the money supply through the coinage of silver, summarised in the slogan, "Free silver," a graduated income tax, government ownership of railroads and other reforms. While the Populist Party itself ultimately failed, many of its ideas would later be adopted during the progressive era of the early 20th century. For Black Americans, the late 19th century was the nadir of post-slavery experience. The hard-won civil rights of Reconstruction were systematically stripped away. Southern states implemented poll taxes, literacy tests, and other measures designed to disenfranchise black voters. In 1896, the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. The reality, of course, was separate and profoundly unequal. Black schools received a fraction of the funding of white schools. Black neighborhoods lacked basic services. Job discrimination confined most black workers to agricultural labor or domestic service. Worse still was the reign of terror imposed through lynching. Extrajudicial murders by white mobs, often conducted as public spectacles with picnicking families watching. Between 1882 and 1968, at least 4,543 people were lynched in the United States, the vast majority of them black men in the South. A black sharecropper hurries his family along a rural road at dusk, their few possessions in a wagon. "Pa, why are we leaving in the night?" his teenage son asks. "We ain't done with the harvest." "Hush now," the father replies tensely. "We just need to be gone from here." What he doesn't say, a white woman had accused a black man of looking at her wrong in town that morning. It didn't matter who. Any black man would do for the mob forming at the courthouse. They needed to be counties away by dawn. In response to these worsening conditions, black leaders debated different strategies for survival and advancement. Booker T. Washington advocated vocational education and economic self-sufficiency, accepting political disenfranchisement for the moment. W.E.B. Du Bois called for full civil rights and liberal arts education for the talented tenth who would lead the race. Both recognized the desperate situation facing Black Americans in an increasingly hostile society. In Latin America, similar racial hierarchies persisted despite the official abolition of slavery and legal equality. Throughout the region, people of indigenous and African descent faced discrimination, economic marginalization, and limited opportunities for advancement. These decades also saw the emergence of the United States as an imperial power beyond its continental borders. The Spanish-American War of 1898 would transform America's role in the hemisphere and the world, launching it on a path to global power status in the coming century. But that's a story for our next part. For now, just drift with the currents of history as they flow toward the 20th century, a time of unprecedented change and challenge for the Americas. Not like your comfortable, peaceful bed in 2025, with no robber barons to worry about, no industrial strife to navigate, just the gentle weight of history's passage carrying you closer to sleep. In 1898, the United States was itching for a fight. The country had grown enormously powerful through industrialization but remained trapped in its continental box. European powers had carved up Africa and were nibbling at Asia. Even Japan had joined the Imperial Club after defeating China in 1895. America wanted a seat at the big boy table. It just needed an excuse. Spain, meanwhile, was having a hell of a time holding on to the sad remnants of its once mighty empire. Cuba and the Philippines were in full-blown revolt. The Spanish response was brutal, including concentration camps where civilians died of disease and starvation. American yellow journalism, sensationalist newspapers that cared more about selling copies than reporting facts, whipped up public outrage. "Have you seen today's Journal?" a man asks his friend at a New York bar, spreading out the newspaper with its screaming headline about Spanish atrocities in Cuba. "Hearst will say anything to sell papers," his friend replies skeptically. "Maybe so, but my cousin's a sailor on the main, says they're sending him to Havana Harbor to protect American interests. Sounds like we're getting ready for something big." The USS Maine was indeed sent to Havana in January 1898. On February 15th, it mysteriously exploded, killing 266 American sailors. Spain denied responsibility, and modern analysts think it was probably an accidental coal bunker fire that ignited the ship's ammunition. But at the time, American newspapers screamed, "Remember the Maine," and demanded war. They got it. The Spanish-American War lasted just 10 weeks from April to August 1898. American naval power quickly destroyed Spanish fleets in the Philippines and Cuba. US troops, including the famous Rough Riders led by Theodore Roosevelt, defeated Spanish land forces. In the peace treaty, Spain ceded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States and granted Cuba independence under US supervision. Just like that, America became a colonial power with overseas territories. The Filipinos, who had been fighting for independence from Spain, were not thrilled to be handed over to a new imperial master. They quickly turned their guns on the Americans, leading to a brutal 3-year conflict that killed at least 200,000 Filipino civilians and 4,200 American soldiers. US troops employed tactics including torture, concentration camps, and burning villages, the same methods Americans had recently condemned Spain for using. "I've been ordered to kill everyone over 10, a US Marine writes in a letter home from the Philippines. "This is not the war we signed up for. These are not the barbarians," his captain admits privately after ordering a village burned. "We are." Cuba gained nominal independence in 1902 but remained an American protectorate. The Platt Amendment, forced into Cuba's constitution, gave the US the right to intervene militarily whenever it deemed necessary and established a permanent naval base at Guantanamo Bay. "What's the difference between Spanish colonialism and American protection?" a Cuban farmer asks his neighbor as they watch US troops patrol their village. "The Americans have better guns and speak a different language," the neighbor replies. "The rest feels about the same. The Spanish-American War marked America's emergence as a global power. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in 1901 after William McKinley's assassination, embraced this new role enthusiastically. He summarized his approach to Latin America with a famous quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." The big stick was used repeatedly. When Colombia refused to accept America's terms for building a canal across Panama, Roosevelt supported a Panamanian revolution in 1903. The new Republic of Panama, utterly dependent on US protection, immediately granted the canal rights America wanted. A Panamanian revolutionary leader meets with his American backers in a discreet Panama City residence. "What guarantee do we have of American support?" he asks. The American agent smiles thinly. "The USS Nashville will be in the harbor tomorrow. Colombian troops won't be allowed to cross the isthmus to stop the revolution. Is that guarantee enough?" The Panamanian hesitates. "And after independence? What will America want in return?" "Only a small strip of land through the center of your country, permanently, under complete American control. That's a high price for freedom. Take it or leave it." The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, was an engineering marvel that transformed global shipping and secured American strategic dominance in the hemisphere. It also symbolized the new relationship between the United States and Latin America, one of profound inequality. This relationship was formalized in the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted America's right to intervene in Latin American countries to prevent European intervention. In practice, this meant US forces were repeatedly sent to protect American business interests and ensure debt repayments to US and European banks. Between 1898 and 1934, the US militarily intervened in Cuba, Panama, Honduras, Nicaragua, Mexico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, the last two occupied for decades. American corporations like United Fruit Company gained enormous power in these countries, leading to the term banana republic for nations effectively controlled by foreign business interests. Dawn breaks over a Guatemalan village. United Fruit Company overseers direct workers harvesting bananas. An old man watches from the edge of the plantation, land that once belonged to his community before the government sold it to the American corporation. "My grandfather is buried there," he tells his grandson, pointing to a spot now covered in uniform rows of banana plants. "Our people farmed this valley for 500 years. Can't we get it back?" the boy asks. The old man shakes his head. "The company has more power than our government. Their security men carry guns. Their managers are friends with the president. That's not fair." "No," the old man agrees, "but that's how it is now." While flexing its muscles internationally, America was also reforming at home. The Progressive Era, spanning roughly from 1890 to 1920, saw efforts to address the social problems created by rapid industrialization and urbanization. Journalists known as muckrakers exposed corruption and exploitation. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, 1906, revealed horrific conditions in meatpacking plants, leading to the Pure Food and Drug Act. Reformers pushed for women's suffrage, prohibition of alcohol, child labor laws, and regulation of monopolies. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson all pursued progressive policies to varying degrees. The federal government broke up monopolies, established the Federal Reserve banking system, created the income tax, and expanded its regulatory powers. But progressivism had its limits. Most reformers accepted racial segregation and scientific racism. Immigration restrictions tightened. Labor activism was often suppressed violently, and American interventions abroad increased even as democracy was being strengthened at home. This contradiction was particularly evident in American policy toward Mexico. When the Mexican Revolution erupted in 1910, ending Porfirio Diaz's 35-year dictatorship, the U.S. response veered between intervention and restraint. The Mexican Revolution began as a political movement against Diaz's authoritarianism, but evolved into a complex social revolution with multiple factions. Francisco Madero, a moderate reformer, overthrew Diaz in 1911, but was himself overthrown and murdered by General Victoriano Huerta in 1913. President Woodrow Wilson, who took office just weeks before Huerta's coup, refused to recognize the new regime, calling it a government of butchers. When American sailors were briefly detained in Tampico in 1914, Wilson used the incident as a pretext to occupy Veracruz, Mexico's main port. The occupation, which lasted 7 months and killed hundreds of Mexicans, inflamed anti-American sentiment. Even Huerta's opponents condemned the violation of Mexican sovereignty. A Mexican dockworker in Veracruz surveys the damage from American naval bombardment. Bodies still lie in the streets as U.S. Marines patrol. They say they came to help us overthrow Huerta, he says bitterly to his neighbor. Do these dead children look helped to you? The Americans always talk about freedom and democracy, the neighbor replies, but they only care about their own freedom, their own democracy. The revolution continued to unfold violently. Huerta was eventually overthrown by a coalition led by Venustiano Carranza, but more radical revolutionaries like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, who demanded fundamental land reform and social justice, continued fighting. Villa, angry at American support for Carranza, attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico in 1916, killing 18 Americans. Wilson sent a punitive expedition under General John J. Pershing into Mexico to capture Villa. For nearly a year, 10,000 American troops chased Villa through northern Mexico without success, further straining U.S.-Mexican relations. The Mexican Revolution eventually resulted in the Constitution of 1917, one of the most progressive documents of its time. It limited foreign ownership of resources, separated church and state, promised land reform, and guaranteed labor rights. But implementing these principles would take decades, and more than 1 million Mexicans died in the fighting. Elsewhere in Latin America, the early 20th century saw both economic growth and deepening dependency on exports to the United States and Europe. The elites in many countries grew wealthy from this trade, but structural inequalities persisted. In Argentina, which had one of the world's highest per capita incomes by 1910, European immigration transformed society. Italian and Spanish immigrants poured in, making Buenos Aires a cosmopolitan city rivaling European capitals, but land and power remained concentrated in the hands of a small oligarchy. In Brazil, the collapse of rubber prices after Southeast Asian plantations broke the Amazon's monopoly, created economic crisis in the north. Coffee dominated exports, tying the country's fortunes to a single commodity with wildly fluctuating prices. When coffee prices crashed, the entire economy suffered. Chile's economy revolved around copper and nitrates, both increasingly controlled by American companies. Peru exported guano, bird droppings used as fertilizer, sugar and cotton. Bolivia depended on tin. All remained vulnerable to price fluctuations and foreign control of key industries. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas remained marginalized, their lands taken for export agriculture or resource extraction, their labor exploited, their cultures denigrated. In the United States, Native Americans had been confined to reservations where poverty and disease were rampant. In 1924, all Native Americans would finally be granted U.S. citizenship, a right denied to the original inhabitants of the continent until nearly 150 years after the country's founding. But by then, their populations had been decimated, their lands taken, and their traditional ways of life largely destroyed. A similar process unfolded throughout Latin America, though with significant regional variations. In countries with large indigenous populations like Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, and Bolivia, indigenous peoples remained a substantial part of the population but faced systematic discrimination and exploitation. Sunset falls over a Quechua village high in the Peruvian Andes. An elder tells stories to children gathered around a small fire. Before the Spanish came, he says in Quechua, our ancestors ruled a great empire. The roads you see on the mountainsides, the terraced fields that feed us, they built these things. Remember this when the teachers in the government school tell you we are backward. A boy looks up. Then, why are we poor now? The elder sighs. Because others took our land, our gold, our labour, because they made us ashamed of our language and our gods. But we are still here. We endure. This resilience in the face of conquest, exploitation, and marginalisation characterised indigenous experiences throughout the Americas. Despite centuries of attempts to eradicate them, indigenous peoples survived and preserved elements of their cultures and identities. By 1914, the Americas had been transformed by over a century of revolution, nation-building, industrialization, and imperialism. The United States had emerged as the dominant power in the hemisphere and a major player on the world stage. Latin American nations had established their independence but struggled with internal divisions and external pressures. Then came the guns of August. World War I erupted in Europe, initially drawing little attention in the Americas, but the conflict would eventually pull the United States into its first major European war and transform global politics in ways that would profoundly affect the Western Hemisphere. The US entered the war in 1917 after German submarine warfare threatened American shipping, and a telegram was intercepted in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States. The war accelerated American industrial growth and strengthened its financial position relative to the European powers. When the war ended in 1918, the United States emerged as the world's largest economy and a major military power. The old European imperial system was mortally wounded. A new global order was emerging in which the United States would play a central role. For Latin America, the war disrupted traditional trading patterns with Europe and increased economic dependence on the United States. American investments in the region grew rapidly, and US political influence expanded accordingly. The stage was set for a new chapter in the history of the Americas, one in which the United States would dominate the hemisphere economically, politically, and culturally in unprecedented ways. But that story belongs to another time. The journey we've taken from the revolutions of independence to the eve of World War I spans more than a century of extraordinary change. We've seen empires fall and new nations rise. We've witnessed slavery's abolition and industrialization's advance. We've followed the struggles of ordinary people, Indigenous, European, African, Asian, as they built lives amid these massive transformations. History is not just the story of presidents and generals, laws and treaties. It's the story of the woman tending her corn in a Mexican village, the slave planning escape along the Underground Railroad, the immigrant stepping onto Ellis Island with dreams of a better life, the Native American preserving ancient traditions despite overwhelming pressure to abandon them. Their stories, millions upon millions of them, make up the rich tapestry of the American experience in all its complexity, tragedy, and triumph. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of these ancestors whose lives, however distant from our own, help shape the world we inhabit today. Rest easy in the knowledge that their struggles were not in vain, that their hopes and dreams echo through time, that their stories live on in the eternal river of human history, flowing ever forward through darkness and light.